What is the clearest understanding of the appropriate use of force to defend oneself or family that harmonizes scenarios from the Old Testament up through the early church, and how it relates to or differs from the threat of harm for simply being Christian?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I don't know of any command that makes self-defense a sin, even self-defense by the use of force a sin. I mean, people probably would think of the turn the other cheek passage. You know, the context for that is largely, again, self-preservation, and I think you can take that choice. But what I'm trying to say is that any kind of self-defense doesn't have to be a sort of first resort. And so I look at the turn the other cheek command as leaving the door open to not defending yourself at all, or at the very least not having it be sort of a reflex, first response, kind of thing. But when it pertains to other people, the text doesn't say turn everybody else's cheek, especially, if it's someone, in your family, someone that you have, there's the whole biblical principle of when it's in your power to do good for someone, you ought to do it. From the book of James, that I would suggest that saving somebody's life is probably a good thing to do for them. And, if that requires the use of force, then I don't see anything that forbids that. So that I don't see the turn the other cheek thing as sort of this cut and dried, no nuancing possible sort of statement. I think there is some nuancing there. I don't know of any principle that says, Christians must be willing to be abused in at all times, places, and manners as well. What I think the point of the command is that you're not combative, you're not the aggressor, you're not. This isn't a first response, kind of thing. You're not looking for a fight, that sort of thing. What Jesus did say, and I think this command largely gets misunderstood. I've not come to bring peace, I've come to bring a sword, or, and he tells them, the disciples at one point, to go out and, take a sword with them. Those are not offensive weapon sort of endorsements. In other words, Jesus isn't saying, well, I'm here to pick a fight, and I want you guys to go out and pick fights as well. The whole idea behind those things is that Jesus knew that when he came and when he started preaching who he was, and he knew where it was going to lead, he knew it would result in, upheaval and persecution. He knew the early church was going to be targeted. And so he actually advocates, in those examples, having something with you to defend yourself. But what I don't want to see is I don't want to see statements like that taken out of context as far as, now we get to, this is our first response. Somebody comes after us because we're Christians, we're going to go beat the crap out of them. That isn't the point at all. It's a very defensive posture. It's not the first response. Again, and these things do have a context, and I don't think that the point of them is either be the aggressor or be the doormat unto death. I mean, if it's just you, you can make that decision. I don't think you're committing suicide necessarily or something like that. But I certainly think there is good reason to believe, again, from the Gospels and some of the statements I've just alluded to, that you are allowed to defend yourself. You think back into the Old Testament. God, there are plenty of examples where God expected his people to defend themselves, against their enemies, when they were threatened with attack or serious bodily harm or death. You're not forbidden from building fences. You're not forbidden from having standing armies. You're not forbidden. You even have the avenger of blood kind of thing, which is a little bit different. But again, it's this notion that God isn't repulsed by using physical force for some appropriate purpose. So the idea of physical force itself is not repugnant to God. So I think the point of a lot of this language is, again, it can't be used to support aggression or, again, a first response kind of reaction, as opposed to defending yourself as kind of a last resort or, again, to protect others. I think another problem is that Christians somehow think the use of force might be okay for less than severe bodily threat. Again, when I think of use of force, and when I see it discussed in Scripture, it's not just a defense against, my city government made another regulation and I don't like it, so I'm going to go down there and, again, beat the tar out of somebody, or I'm going to threaten their family, and say, you can't do that. This is a terrible law. This is persecuting, my church. So I'm going to go threaten you with bodily harm. This is absurd, but I mention it because we do have some of this thinking in the church. the church has somehow been conflated with the Sons of Liberty or something, in the Revolutionary period, that we're being oppressed by the king, so let's go, burn somebody's house down or destroy their property or something like that. Again, these are absurd conflations, and I do see them in places in the church. We have to see them for what they are. They're conflating two different things. They're combining two different things that shouldn't be combined. So I think we have to guard against that. What I'm talking about, what I think of the intent of the question is this situation where you have severe bodily harm, perhaps, threat of death, kind of thing. Can you defend yourself? And I think, yeah, you can certainly defend yourself. I mean, this whole idea about authority, Romans 13, we're quick to quote that, but Romans 13, of course, presupposes that the government is doing good things. It's, punishing the wicked and rewarding the person who's obedient. We often aren't in those situations, and I'm not going to say that I'm not going to contradict Paul and say those powers that be aren't really ordained by God. I think they are ordained by God. No government authority. I mean, just let's go back and think about the book of Daniel, because Daniel actually has these discussions when he's interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dream. No governing authority gets to where it is unless God allows it. God sets up kings and he tears them down. So it's true that every governing authority is where it is because God has allowed that. But that doesn't mean that God endorses it. He doesn't mean he's happy with it. It doesn't even mean that it's not under wrath. Okay, in the Old Testament, yeah, God used Assyria. He used Babylon to punish his own people. But they were also under wrath. I mean, their judgment was pending, and it was going to be even worse than what he was using them for. So I think, again, we need to contextualize Romans 13 a little bit. I mean, the apostles themselves said we ought to obey God rather than man. You go back in the Old Testament, you have the Egyptian midwives. They were blessed by God because they didn't kill the babies. Daniel's friends, they didn't bow down, to the image of Nebuchadnezzar. And they were, the Lord saved them when their own lives were in peril. Obadiah, he's sort of a forgotten figure, not the one that the prophetic book's named after, but during the time of Elijah, Obadiah was the guy who hid the prophets of the Lord from under, right under Ahab's nose. Okay, God rewarded him for that. These are all resistances to governing authority. And what I'm saying is they're not contradictory to Romans 13. I mean, the rule of thumb is when a governing authority mandates or tries to force you to sin against the higher authority, the highest authority, which would be God, you're under no obligation to obey that. I'm sorry, Lord, I had to go worship Baal because the king said so. That's not acceptable. God isn't going to say, oh, well, I'll give you a pass for that one. No, that's not acceptable. And so I do think in Scripture we have a principle that there is a time when Christians are not only allowed to resist that sort of authority, but they're sort of expected to resist that authority. And you might be in a context where you can defend yourself. A lot of these contexts, of course, you can't. And you should be willing, again, to suffer if you're suffering for the right things, as Peter so often said in his writings, because Jesus suffered. But you may also run into contexts where you can protect yourself. And again, I see glimpses of this in the Gospels where Jesus warns his followers that this is what it's going to come to. So take a sword with you, be able to defend yourself, to fight off your enemies. He didn't just go out and say, when somebody comes at you with a sword, just lay down there and say, where do you, stab me somewhere, make it quick, that kind of thing. We don't see that. But we never see the use of a sword or, again, the use of force as a first response or in an aggressive mode where something, less than, life and limb is at stake. So I think you can look at scriptural examples and put together, a picture of how it's appropriate to respond in certain situations. We can sit here and theorize and do the philosophizing about how it's best to stay out of harm's way. And I think, sure, that's good, but you're not always going to be able to do that. So, I used to tell my kids, and they're older now. I mean, they're basically grown, but I would still tell them, look, I want you to know that if there's a guy coming through the room or through the window into your room and you start yelling and Dad comes into the room and he's trying to get you, I want you to know that Dad will kill that guy before he lets him take you. I want you to know that your life is more important than that guy's life. that I won't stop and say, oh, I could probably protect my daughter here if I killed this guy, but I can't figure out a way to do. Oh well, it's just too bad. It's just too bad. I wish I could have found a less violent way to protect my kids. I wanted my kids to know that Dad was their defender and he would do whatever it took. And again, I think we're obligated, to do that in extreme circumstances, because if it's in the power of your hand to do good, that I think is a pretty easy definition of doing good. Not allowing my daughter to get abducted, that would be good to her. I'm going to do it. So that's how I think about that whole subject. I know that was a little bit of round robin, kind of thing, but hopefully there you found an answer, or at least some direction.
Well, Mike, when you're defending, are you going full-blown MMA or old-school boxer? What's Mike?
I'm doing whatever is necessary to disable the person as fast as possible.
Okay.